Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the podcast, my guest is Trisha Talbot. Trisha is the managing principal of Doc Properties, which is a commercial real estate firm helping physicians buy, sell, operate, deal with the buildings that their practices operate in. Trisha and I had a great conversation. As you can probably tell, I am dealing with a little bit of a head cold and am a little bit congested. Apologies for that. Nonetheless, we had a great conversation. As I've talked about a little bit on the podcast in the past, in prior episodes, this concept of owning the building in which your business operates can be a huge wealth building tool. And that's precisely what Trisha helps physicians do. We talk about the details, the pitfalls, a lot of the nuances of what it looks like to buy or even build the building that your business operates in. She is a wonderful resource for physicians specifically, but we had a great chat about this, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hey, everybody. Real quick before we jump into today's episode, I have been advised by my attorneys to remind you all that none of what you might hear in today or any other episode of Grow Money Business is financial, investing, tax, legal, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and deploy on your own terms. And before you take any actions on what we might cover in the show, I really encourage you to consult with your accountant, attorney, or financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner and think that you might need one, be sure to check out threeoakswealth.com to learn more about my firm's planning, advice, and investment services. Trisha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Grant. Thanks for having me.
I am really excited to talk to you today because as a financial planner, we work with a lot of business owners in my financial planning practice. And one topic that I've talked a lot about with clients, and we talked a little bit about on the podcast, is this concept of owning the building in which your business operates. It's a huge wealth building opportunity for a lot of people. There are tax benefits, there are other benefits, and this is something that you specialize in for healthcare people. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your business and what you do every day.
Sure. My name is Trisha Talbot, and I am the managing principal at Doc Properties, and I handle commercial real estate for healthcare properties. I've been doing this for about 20 years, started on the leasing side, and then moved over into the sales side. So I've worked with a lot of physicians in different age stages of their career, and for those that are typically earlier in their career, or maybe they're just they've been a single practitioner site, they've kind of geared more towards leasing, but then when they've wanted to grow, you either expand into multiple sites. If they're tenant improvements, when they first leased space, they went ahead and paid for the tenant improvements, whatever the landlord wouldn't contribute, signed a lease. And then at the end, they've put a ton of money into space that they don't own, and they can't take the tenant improvements with them. They can take some equipment, but some require some pretty complex build out. If they do any sort of procedures, they have to, put a lot of money into the spaces. So then they try to, I don't know if you remember the office condo that was pretty popular here in Arizona, where a developer would buy some land and then build office condos they would do about 10,000 square foot buildings and then either divide them in quarters or in halves. And that sort of solved some of the issue where if they were a smaller practice or a single practice, they could still own and build out their space. And at the end of the day, they are building equity. The issue with those is sometimes practices grow, sometimes they shrink. It's hard to expand adjacent to you when you don't know the owner, or the owner could be a completely separate business. So there were some, I think, complexities there. And now I'm seeing where some entrepreneurial physicians, that just with the way healthcare is going, they're looking at, how can I leverage, I would say, time and money into something that is easy for me to understand, something that, I don't need to have a part-time job or, a second degree to really understand, and then, have some other income other than just what I'm doing from 8 to 5. Physicians typically do earn, they're high earners, and therefore, they are looking to figure out how to invest in themselves. And so, then they go out and want to purchase a property, then, invest the tenant improvements that they can keep, in 10 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever their lease term is. They don't have to build it all out again. And they just have to maybe upgrade some things as they own the property. Sometimes they even purchase a bigger property than they need and have some income in addition to the space that they use. So I think that it offers a lot of options for them. At the end of their practice, they can keep the building and lease it out. Sometimes they'll sell their practice to another physician and could stay there and pay them rent. I just think that there's a lot of opportunities.
Awesome. So the physician is running their practice. They're interested in purchasing the building in which their practice operates. They come and see you. And one of the first things that we're looking at is, hey, you've put all this money into the tenant improvements in your existing location. Let's figure out how to transfer those into this new place that you might purchase. Did I summarize that fairly?
Well, it's hard to transfer tenant improvements. You can't bring the walls with you, but the equipment that some furniture fixtures and equipment, they can, but they can't typically take cabinets and walls with them, obviously. So
Right.
They are starting from scratch. What I'm saying is they've understood that, had they purchased a property rather than lease it the last time, they wouldn't have to build. They don't want to go and lease another space where they pay to build it out, and they don't own the tenant improvements, and they can't take them with them next time. So then they buy a building, put in the tenant improvements, and they can keep them more or less.
So what you're saying is that there can be a lot of cost, right? You pay for all this stuff in an existing lease, but you want to buy a new building. Obviously, we can't take the walls with us, but how do we make this jump to the new location with minimum unnecessary out-of-pocket spending?
I don't know if that's what I'm saying, but so if they lease a space, they have to. So when you lease a space, your out-of-pocket costs are typically there's some construction costs, there's architectural fees, and then there's the FF&E. You're going to have that same cost. I mean, you'll probably be able to bring some equipment over, but you're going to have those same costs in a new space that you own. But at the end of 5 or 7 or 10 years, you don't have to move and you don't have to move, and you own those tenant improvements. There's also some depreciation that you'll be able to realize that you can't when you lease a space. And so there's a lot of benefits long-term to own rather than lease.
So where do you start? You're thinking about making this jump. What are the first few things you got to look at?
Well, I think for practices, the first thing is patient base. What patient base are you trying to attract? What insurance do you accept? Are you workers' comp based on insurance or private insurance? Do you take any sort of Medicare or Medicaid? What is your patient base? And usually practices know. They if they're already leasing someplace and the practice is thriving, they're not going to want to move very far from where that location is, unless they're looking to dramatically change their patient base. But today, I think being conveniently located near your patients when you're an outpatient practice is what I am hearing a lot of physicians aiming to do, which is why they open up multiple sites, because there's a certain drive time that becomes uncomfortable for patients. So they'll open up another site to capture a patient base once the drive becomes too long. So I think for healthcare practices, it really starts with what patients you're wanting to attract.
Sure. A lot of businesses in other industries will seek to buy buildings that their business will occupy only about 51% of. And I'm fighting a head cold today, so I sound a little bit stuffed up. But the reason for that is you get all this great SBA-backed financing when your business is occupying at least half of the building. And it allows the business owner to lever up a little bit more, buy a larger space, lease out the other portion to other businesses, and then use that as kind of a wealth building tool. Are you seeing that with physician practices as well? What kind of buildings are coming across your desk these days?
Sometimes. So a lot depends on the supply of real estate. So if they are building from scratch and there's just they know what size of space that they need. They only, they're, like you said, they'll occupy maybe 12,000 square feet of it, but the land that they find, it can be built up to 20,000 square feet. Being a real estate person, obviously I'm like, well, that's a no brainer. You build 20,000 square foot building, you occupy 12,000, you hire a leasing broker to fill the rest, you underwrite it to where, the market terms of the landlord is what you would have to supply for tenant improvements. You get the SBA loan with the money, reserves to pay for the construction of, and offer tenant improvements, and brokerage fees and all of the other costs, architectural fees that you'll need to incur as a landlord. And I recommend doing that. Also, for physicians, you can lease it out to a complementary tenant where, there's some sort of referral pattern. So that, is always good. Or, say, I don't know, you're a cardiologist, but you want to have an internal medicine as an example, next to you that, you guys refer business to make it convenient and easy for your patients. So for me, I think that it is exciting. Some practices don't want more building. I think, part of it comes with, well, who's going to manage it? I don't necessarily want to be a landlord. My office manager can handle, just our space, but then I have to, worry about collecting rent. And with that, I strongly encourage, especially, these physicians that are practicing, they're they're already working, 16-hour days out of, 8 hours sometimes. But or they're in procedures all day, that's when you hire a property manager. It is well worth their weight in gold. You budget for the expense, but they can meet vendors. I mean, I even would recommend this for their own space and not necessarily burden their office manager, which I'm sure is already burdened with managing the office and every appointment scheduling and billing. I mean, all of that stuff. So I actually recommend, even if they're going to own commercial real estate, to hire a professional property management company that can manage vendors if something breaks, that can collect rent, do property accounting and all of those services. So I, uh, it depends again on the supply. So, if there's a lot of options, if there's buildings that are exact size or buildings that are a little bit bigger, if they have to build, all of those factors start the decision process of what is the supply in the location they want to be, and then you sort of narrow down your options.
And that's for any kind of setup, even if your business is occupying 100% of the building. You're saying property manager still makes a lot of sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense, unless you have an office manager that has a former property management background and can handle it no problem. It just, I think the learning curve is challenging. And there's people that do this as their professional job. They have relationships with vendors that can, save you money rather than you just getting Googling, people to help you. There's also in certain markets, there are service providers that specifically have specifically work on medical office buildings. So the hazardous waste isn't an issue. They understand that the janitorial has to be incredibly exceptional because you can't have dirty medical spaces. And they understand what a medical property needs and are able to provide that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, Trisha, was asset prices across the. I'm an investments guy, right? So we look at, well, is the stock market expensive or cheap? Somebody comes in with an investment idea. Is this undervalued or overvalued? And when I look at the landscape of stuff that ordinary people might invest in, it's all very, very expensive right now. Everything is very, very expensive right now. Real estate price of my house has been up, 20% or so in the last year, and I don't know that that's not a bubble, to be honest. What is your take on commercial property asset prices, particularly where you live? And you're in Arizona, right? Scottsdale?
I'm in Arizona, yeah. Well,
so how do you think about this as an investment kind of thing?
Well, I think when you're looking at, a house is a long-term investment, but I think a house, you could look at 5 years, but commercial real estate, you really need to look at I think, at a 10-year minimum time horizon. If you're going to be an owner user, because there are some upfront costs that just take time to recoup. And across the board, medical office assets the prices are really high right now. The cap rates are incredibly compressed. There's a lot of money chasing them because a lot of the hype behind them, the marketing of that they are recession resilient. And so, people are also concerned, I think, with the Amazon effect that the retail asset class went through and are pivoting from. And then now with regard to the pandemic, the office sector is going to have to, I think, pivot as well. So then they say, well, what property asset classes are strong? And right now I hear it. Industrial is incredibly strong. Data warehouses are strong. And multifamily is insane. And then there's medical office. Well, why? Because medical office typically has long-term leases. It's not 3 years. It's usually a minimum of 5 years. There's just too much, like I said, the tenant improvements, they have to amortize over a term of a lease, and it's not economically sensible to do that on a short-term lease for anybody. So leases typically start at 5 years. More, if they're shell spaces, it's 7 or 10 years. And even if a physician owns a building, as you put a lease on it, and the lease, you have to be able to justify market rent. So you can't, you can't say, well, I'm going to pay whatever I want for a building and then back into the rental rate. You really have to, understand what the rental rate is. And when you purchase a building and build it out, you still need to stay to where if you had to leave the property and lease it out to somebody else, you could still make your mortgage payment to your lender and then and cover all the operating costs. Right now, a lot of the increase is due to material and labor shortages. So demand is high and supply is low, so prices go up. That is driving a ton. And then just in popular places, land prices are increasing as well. So all of those increase costs, and then therefore they have to be underwritten with a certain ability to be able to recoup those costs. So the real estate fundamentals still have to be true, even when you're investing in property. But the costs are high. The demand is high in medical office. There's a lot of money chasing it, and that's just causing the prices to go up.
Yeah. Yeah, you said a couple of things I want to dive into in a little bit more detail. One of them is, and this is really fundamental. Anytime you're talking about commercial real estate investing, this is not a short-term play. This is a long-term kind of thing. I like the time horizon that you mentioned at the beginning of, you probably need to be looking at this in terms of 10 years, a 10-year
Mm-hmm.
window or longer.
Mm-hmm.
Anything inside of that is just super dangerous, really. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
you're thinking about getting into this and then growing your practice or your business and then selling it and flipping it for something else, that's a pretty dangerous proposition. This needs to be a longer term play, which coincidentally is another reason I like the idea of occupying 51% of the building, leasing out the other 49%, maybe on shorter term leases if you can set it up that way, and then growing into the space over time just to give yourself a little bit more of a runway without having to sell the business or opening up a second location.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is this concept of the lease terms being an arm's length transaction. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? You cannot give yourself, if you, the individual, owns the building and the business is leasing space from the building and you as the owner of that building, you can't just write whatever you want down on the lease. What parameters do we need to keep in mind when filling out lease terms?
Right. And so it has to meet market conditions. So you have to typically, you can hire an appraiser, but I would also recommend that you get a broker opinion of value, because the brokers are the ones that are doing the deals all day long, and so they know where things are actually striking and the other terms. And you when a lender, so there's two things. One, you have to get a lender to give you money. And so in order to do that, the lender wants to understand, again, just like I said, if you were to have to vacate the property and lease it out, they're not going to give you more money than what you can lease it out for in the regular market. Um, because they're conservative and they're not going to just write you a blank check. So it has to be based on some underwriting fundamentals. And so they'll look at, what is the business paying you for a lease? And it has to be based on current market conditions, how much money you're asking them for the build out, and improvement dollars, which also you could ask for coverage of architectural fees, which are the soft costs or hard costs. The soft costs, hard cost is the actual cost of constructing it, labor and materials, and then the soft costs, architectural fees and legal fees and things like that you need. So, you put all of these costs, you go to a lender, like you said, and give you, especially FBA, they want to have a budget and they want to have everything documented. Um, they feel that you're saying, hey, I'm going to buy the building and have my business pay an above market lease rate so I can try to go to the bank and get more money. They will see through it because they will have their team underwrite it based on market conditions. So that's one thing. And then if you go to sell it, say you have sale leasebacks are pretty popular too. Sometimes a physician, will get purchased by a hospital or maybe another group and they take over the lease. Well, then if the physician owns the building and it's being leased to a hospital, they can then sell that to an investor. So the lease, the hospital is not going to take just an above market lease. They're going to look at your lease rates and they're going to, if they take over the lease, they're going to want they'll either make you write them down to market conditions if it's not, or, they'll require a new lease. And then when you sell it, the investors, they are going to also look at your lease and analyze the lease rate, because if it's not market conditions, then they will write it down to market conditions and then cap the income off of that, which if you've inflated the rate, you're going to just have to accept a lot lesser price. And they'll probably make you sign a new lease based on market conditions. So everything needs to be still based on the current market real estate fundamentals, just to keep yourself in line with all the other financial markets.
Yeah. Yeah. All the reasons that we might want to have a lease agreement with your business that are substantially different than what the market is telling you the lease rates ought to be are really short term in nature. And it is so much easier and so much cleaner just to get a second opinion, a broker, appraiser, or maybe a combination, I don't know, of
Mhm.
people in there to tell you what the market rates are and then have that be the rate. Because
Mhm.
if you play games with this, you have to unwind it later, and it's a huge nuisance. I've seen it numerous times.
Yeah. And it typically hurts because you've inflated yourself. You get used to having that inflation, and then you have to come back to reality. And I think, in my opinion, that's a rougher way to go, rather just than start the right way and build it up from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So one concept I wanted to run by and get your thoughts on is you mentioned that the supply and demand dynamics across the country, specifically in Arizona, where you're doing a lot of operations. There's just a lot more demand for this kind of space than there is supply right now. And so one thing that comes to mind is, well, why don't you go get a construction loan and build your own building? And we've had a couple clients go that route in the past. Granted, you have your own supply chain concerns there of getting the materials that it takes to build a new building. What is that process like? Can you make an argument for going that route or not going that route, perhaps?
Well, that would be a great route to go if there was small parcels available for sale everywhere. But again, with the supply, sometimes, for example, if they only want a 20,000 square foot building, but then, someone only wants to sell a parcel off and it's 3 acres. So you have more land than you need or know what to do with. So you either maybe I'm dealing with this with a client in Houston. So, my first, the first thing is, to split a parcel costs, you have to, you have to go into a municipality. You have to spend money on splitting the parcel, and then because you have to, and then go through the municipality for it as well. That takes time, and it takes a surveyor to go out and do that, and then they have to redefine the parcel. Depending on how utilities are run, you have to go through all of those easements and stuff like that. So sometimes it's easy, it's clean, and sometimes it's really messy, and it just depends. So that's a process. If sometimes you have to buy more land than you need, and then if it's all one parcel, then you have to subdivide it. And that's just um, sometimes people don't want to go through that, and sometimes they do. It just depends. If you can buy it and you don't mind subdividing it and then selling off the smaller pieces, but then, like anything with real estate, it's like then somebody wants more than, what you have available, and they want a bigger piece when you're trying to sell it. So, in that scenario, it would probably make more sense to try to build a bigger building, maybe joint venture with a developer. There's developers, then you become more, there's an active way of, there's so many partnerships that you can have in a joint venture in healthcare. There's a lot of developers and investors in the asset class that specifically focus on it. So in that case, I would recommend perhaps going the joint venture route. Then you get a developer to buy the bigger piece. They build either one or two buildings. You're a partner in the real estate, but the joint venture person typically, depending on how it's structured, you can either share risk or they take all the risk and you become a passive investor. And that's another route for people to go then, because they get kind of the best of both worlds, where the practice gets ownership but less risk and less responsibility. But again, it goes back to, can you find the parcel of land that is the exact size that you need for the building size that you're looking to build? And it's like the Goldilocks. You go out there and you have to look, because sometimes they're too big, sometimes they're too small, and sometimes they're just right. And you just have to go out and start the process. And this is why I tell, I've said this before on other interviews, you know, if you are looking to own your own building, you are doing yourself a huge disservice if you wait until the last 30 days of your lease, 6 months of your lease. You need to be looking 3 years before your lease is expired. You need a lot of runway. You need to be able to, um, the worst the worst way to invest in real estate is when you feel like you're under pressure and have no other choices. You need to be able to go out, negotiate with a couple of different people, see who will give you the best um, opportunity. And then you also need to feel that if it's not a good situation, that you can just walk away and say, this isn't a good fit. I need to go, but I have enough time to go find another option. So that's, you need to leave yourself some room for that as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And you see this when people are trying to execute 1031 exchanges or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, where they're close to close on a sale, and then once the close happens, the cash goes to this what's called a qualified intermediary, and then I think you have 45 days
Mm-hmm.
to express interest in
Identify, yeah.
the next one, right? I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's a pretty tight window if you haven't done enough forethought.
Well, not only that, when you're selling a property and somebody comes, like if you're selling I would say a property that is attractive, um, and you get 1031 people looking at it, they can identify up to three. So when they come to you, so 1031s have some trickiness to them, depending on which side you're on. But yeah, when they come to you and they're like, well, we have 45 days to identify, and this is one of three, they could always back out on the deal as well. So 1031s are tricky all the way around.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Okay, so 3 years before you really want to close. What do those 3 years
Before you
look like?
want to occupy, like before
Before you
you
want to
want your
occupy, okay, but
doors to
before
be
your lease is up.
open. Yeah. So I would say when you're getting into with 3 years left on your lease, if you are wanting to own a property, you need to engage, and start looking to find out what's out there. What are your options? Analyze the costs of all of them and not feel like you have to make a poor real estate decision in order to meet a desired timeline.
Sure, sure. Okay. Now, what kind of down payment are lenders offering these days? What is the spectrum you're running into?
Well, conventional financing, depending again on a lot of factors, but I think 25% on the low end, and then they go up from there. And that's if you have spectacular credit. But SBA lending is why, it's it's attractive for physicians because they are small business owners, for the most part. And um, you'll probably know more than I what the current rates are, but I think they are 90-10. And then during the summer, they were having like no money down, and they were waiving all these fees and things like that. But the SBA is an attractive product.
Yeah, and that's why I keep going back to this 51% threshold. In an owner-occupied building, and it's at least half of the square footage, I think is how they define it. They'll lend you up to 90% of the purchase price, and
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty doggone good. And so, depending on
Mm-hmm.
the space you're looking at, probably a couple $100,000 investment. But then, from that point on, you lease the rest of the space out. Your practice, your business grows. It opens the door for 1031 exchanges into larger properties in the future to defer the gains and so forth. And that's just on capital gains deferral too. There are a lot of other tax advantages in the meantime of owning these things. Do you want to dive into that a little bit, Trish?
Well, depreciation
I
is,
said Trish. I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Trisha. Do you
That's
prefer
okay.
Trish or Trisha?
Either one. It's not that different. Well, depreciation is a huge one. Obviously, you can also deduct taxes and interest, property taxes and interest. So, there's a lot of advantages, and I try to stay in my lane and out of the accountants, because they sometimes have different opinions, or I'm not describing it in enough detail for them. So,
it's okay. We've got a disclosure at the beginning of this podcast. None of this is tax advice. We talk taxes all the time. It's not tax advice.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And then, there's also, with regard to this lease, it's a way for them to have income that is not taxed at ordinary income rates. So, they get the income from the rental income, and it usually goes through an LLC. So, there's benefits there as well to, take some of your operating income that you receive and not have it go through as W-2.
Yeah. And I think of this back into the setting the distinction of two separate entities. And as you mentioned, you probably don't want your business to own the building. You probably want to own it through another entity.
Mm-hmm.
It should have some kind of asset protection feature. And so most owners that go this route will prefer to do that through an LLC. But the building sits in an LLC. That entity owns the building. That's the entity that owes the mortgage. That's the entity that collects rent. It's also the entity that gets to depreciate the building and write off property taxes and all this other nice stuff, mortgage interest and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all these nice tax deductions. Then you have rental income coming into it that offsets a lot of that income for tax purposes. And so a large portion, if not all, of the income you have coming in through rents is tax-free because of those nifty tax deductions. Now, the other entity is the pre-existing business. The business is going to have to rent space from somebody anyway, right? And so you may as well have that be yourself and set it up in a way that enables a fair amount of that rent to go to yourself to pay down the mortgage, build equity, and anything left on top comes in, maybe some of it tax-free because of those offsetting deductions. It's a pretty efficient and nifty way to set it all up. And if you think of it from the standpoint, like we were talking about a minute ago, of once your equity grows beyond a certain point, if you're doing this from a real estate investing perspective, you can swap into other larger properties. Again, don't go into this thinking you're going to do that inside of 10 years. But if you're holding it long term, you can lever up again and swap into a larger property. And based on the current tax code, we're currently enabled to kick the capital gains taxes down the road through a 1031. So there's just a number of ways this is beneficial. I think the hurdle for most people is that it does require a down payment, a cash outlay, and it's work, right? Even if you hire a property manager, it takes a lot of effort setting all this stuff up, and there is a degree of risk, being that you can't call the landlord anytime anything breaks or doesn't suit your needs as a tenant.
Right. And, there's very good landlords out there. So again, I think it comes back to, especially this is specific to healthcare properties, the practice really needs to look at their businesses first, the supply and demand of buildings in the market, if there's available land, if there's buildings that they can purchase and either do an adaptive reuse through some rezoning. There's so many decision-making factors in there as to what makes the most sense. Obviously, if you can own it and you're a practice, it financially, you financially for you as an individual, it offers a lot more opportunity. And there are landlords, with physicians, they know that physicians, they add the tenant is the value in a medical office building. And there's a lot of landlords out there. They do physician ownership in a variety of different ways. But, if you sign this is pretty popular, especially in brand new buildings. But some, are in any building, but a lot in brand new buildings where, they say, sign a long-term lease, you'll get this amount of ownership. Some allow them to buy into ownership if they want to get more. It really just depends. But again, they can still have some ownership benefits, not as much as owning the building themselves with the tax stuff. But, there is a way for physicians to get ownership. There's a way for physicians to get value for their tenancy commitment in a building. And if, like I said, if there's a development opportunity with land, there are a lot of developers that are very interested in partnering with physicians, and they would do a development and give them ownership and things like that. So, in that sense, there are ways for them to own property with mitigating some risk and capital outlay if it's available in their market. And those are opportunities to consider if, for instance, there's not land available in really dense markets where it's hard to do. I'm coming from the Southwest where, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, there's land available. And, like in California, there's not in some places, in the cities. So it depends on your market, what's available, and then sort of going down the decision-making process from there.
Yeah. That's a good point. There are more avenues for joint venture in this sphere than there have ever been before. Absolutely.
And very experienced people in doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other thing. You have a partner who knows what the heck they're doing. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see people
for you?
What was that?
They've already made all the mistakes for you.
That's right. Yeah. You can kind of learn from their wisdom.
Yeah.
Where do you see physicians and others getting into trouble these days, getting out over their skis and having to unwind things in a hurry?
If they're not familiar with the construction process, and it's just because they don't know some of the questions to ask. They would hire a general contractor, but really, so what the value you get with joint venturing or just really having the time to interview a developer or a general contractor is really understanding the costs involved, having a contingency amount, because I would love for construction to be a straight line, but it never typically is. Also, again, because of the labor shortage, you don't want to be stuck, halfway through a project and not be able to finish it. And architects as well, you want to make sure that you work with an architect that, hopefully has built a medical building before, has designed one, that knows how it needs to be efficient, just in the way that it's constructed, what patients are looking for. There's different needs. There doesn't need to necessarily be, medical buildings are functional in every way. And so, it's nice to have like common areas that have a little splash. But other than that, the spaces inside are very functional. I would say, depending on the tenants that are going to be in there, finishes need to be durable. It's, you don't want to have to be replacing finishes every couple of years. There's walkers, wheelchairs, those things to consider. And in, medical buildings, people do get sick. So you want things that, can be cleaned easily. So just things like that you wouldn't necessarily even think about unless you were, you've done it before and made mistakes and doing it again. So
Sure. And that's on the new construction side. What about purchases of pre-existing buildings? Where do you see physicians getting into trouble there?
So if the building's vacant, again, knowing where the building is to where you want it to be and how expensive it's going to be to get there. So if you're you're a cardiology practice and you want to have, obviously, I think have some diagnostic testing and echo. They do the treadmills. That you want to have some rooms with all this equipment in there. What will it take? Imaging is another good example. Not every building can be an imaging building. There needs to be, a certain amount of power to the building. And if it's not there, sometimes you have to bring it in from the street, which is, a huge cost and expense. If it's going to be a surgery center, you're going to have a procedure room. You need to be able to put a backup generator somewhere. Typically, the OR has to have its own HVAC, so you have to have space for these things. So those are just some of the things, that unless you kind of know what you're doing, sometimes those mistakes could be expensive to correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what did we miss, Trisha? We've talked a lot about the process, getting into this, what things to think about, mistakes some people you've seen make along the way. What else do you think is relevant for business owners out there considering a purchase of a building for their business in medicine and otherwise to reside in?
Yeah, I think if you're going to go along this process and you already operate and are dependent on income from a business that you are working in full time, you really do need to, I highly recommend that you hire real estate experts. And even if you are well versed in real estate and feel that you could do some of it yourself, I think you have to ask yourself, how valuable is my time and do I want to do it? Because it could come anywhere from become a part-time job to a completely second job. And I think it just depends if you want to do that, or if you want to hire people that, can be working on this during, daytime hours and be communicating with you on what decisions you need to make in an efficient way. And then you maybe spend 30 minutes to an hour and do them. I mean, it's like, I guess an analogy is, taxes and what you do, financial planning. Can other people do it? Sure. But do they have the time to sit and really spend it doing it? And do they want to do that with their time?
I think that is a good analogy and widely applicable to a lot of fields. And from my perspective, I don't want to be doing the property management on a building that I own, but that's just me. A lot of people want to do that, and that's cool too.
Yeah. So that's how I would leave it. And obviously there's very specific questions to very specific situations that people may have, and that we didn't cover, but those are specific to different situations.
So how do people get a hold of you? Tell us about what you do, what your website is for physicians out there looking for help in this area.
Yeah, so my website is docproperties.com. Has a lot of information on there. I also have a podcast that is linked through there. If people want, there's some valuable information that people can get from those interviews. And my email is the best way to get a hold of me, which is Talbot, T Talbot, TTALBOT @docproperties.com. So Talbot @docproperties.com.
Right on. Well, thank you, Trisha, for taking the time and enlightening us on some of these issues. I think it was great, and I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements. And feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.